Welcome back to another episode of Sip and Streamline with your co-hosts today, myself, Isabella Tedisco, and Pat Peterson. Today we're going to be diving into the world of SharePoint Intranets and employee communication hubs. To start us off, I'd like to introduce my sip of the day, which is a little mini Diet Coke, which, I think the minis are arguably a little bit better than the full-size cans. Just my hot take of the day as well, but what about you, Pat? What are you drinking?
First of all, the mini cans are a really nice way of just having enough, but not too much of right. that for it. So I am having a homemade iced mocha today. So have some chocolate in there, as well as a double shot of espresso and some 2% milk. So it's like going to your favorite coffee shop, but homemade. So it is delicious on this spring day.
Love a DIY coffee. I think those are a little bit better. So kind of diving into what we're talking about today, employee communication hubs and intranets. I know we see a lot of organizations kind of trying to adopt this within their employee space as well. I think something I always like to bring up with intranets and employee communication hubs working within SharePoint specifically is if you're already in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, it really kind of removes the aspect of having to jump into a different outside platform that hosts your intranet or employee communication hub, and kind of removes that process of it and work in that one specific environment. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think the key thing that when somebody comes to me and says, I need a better way to communicate with my staff, if I think through the last 4 or 5 years, folks are not in the same physical office anymore. The bulletin board on a wall doesn't work. And I think a lot of organizations have moved to intranets, and either they've purchased one or they've tried to make SharePoint work in the past. And when we look at what's available today, I think some of the solutions today with tying with SharePoint as well as with Viva connections and just more or less even the ability now to bring Copilot to help author pages in SharePoint, I think really changes the way that you can approach the communication hub portion of it. So the first thing that I think of is when somebody says, I need a communication hub, it's they need to engage their employees more efficiently, and email isn't working. Mm-hmm. So that's where I pull from. But I guess as you're looking at it, Isabella, from a communication hub perspective, what does that look like in an organization? From your experience or your opinion?
Yeah, I think the best intranets I have seen kind of combine the aspect of having a file repository in SharePoint combined with that landing page or, home intranet, because that's really creating that centralized location for employees to go to for both, their everyday work files as well as those communication outlets. So kind of combining the two, I think, creates that space to be the most beneficial for employees to utilize. I think too, when we think about how customizable an intranet is now in SharePoint, we have the added benefit of the new site branding center in SharePoint, where, you can establish that site branding to roll across, all associated sites to that hub. Create the different elements of, your marketing branding guide and kind of establish that within your SharePoint environment. But then also kind of having that creative element to it, who's going to manage it, who's going to update it, is also really important to recognize when you are assessing whether or not your organization needs a employee communication hub. Being able to kind of assess that, but also having the means to be able to update it quite frequently is important.
When you see the kind of that SharePoint intranet and authoring content, who do you see at organizations being responsible for maintaining the content on the page? Is it IT?
Yeah, a lot of times it can be IT. It really just depends on how large the organization is. Most of the time, it's the marketing department that's kind of managing that content and making sure it's up to date. Also changing that look and feel of the intranet periodically to establish that new element to people's work environment. But most of the time we'll try to assess who the specific department champions, if you will, are within the organization. So, something like an accounting and finance team might have that main leader. They'll be kind of incorporated in that intranet discussion to understand what from accounting and finance needs to be displayed on an intranet, things like that. So when we think about it that way, I think we're kind of establishing these unique people from their specific positions to have that ability to maintain and update the intranet. But really depending on the size of the organization, sometimes it's just the marketing department, sometimes it's just IT. It's really who is willing and able to learn more about updating and maintaining an intranet in SharePoint.
But it's fair to say it doesn't take an IT person to manage SharePoint pages anymore, like it did with previous versions of SharePoint. So when we think about Viva, Viva, we rattle off Viva Connections. That's one of the tools in the suite of Viva that Microsoft has. Viva Connections is the ability really to take your home site, if you will, and make that be a pinned app with inside of Teams, which is really, I think frontline workers, desk workers, workers that don't want to open up a tab browser to get there. Are there any other features that come with Viva Connections that might be worth exploring that help with that engagement?
Yeah, kind of having that Viva Connections dashboard within your Teams environment that can directly connect to the SharePoint intranet that you're utilizing, I think is really important because, a lot of the times we're seeing people just kind of working in one specific platform. So that kind of allows for that communication between the two platforms to happen. So I find that to be very beneficial. And then the customizable dashboards, just depending on what people are utilizing within the actual Microsoft 365 environment, that could be very, very helpful as well. How about you? Have you seen anything, with Viva Connections specifically that I know Viva is a huge space that I know we're going to explore in some more of our conversations, but anything from that realm?
I think from you mentioned it, that separate page, right? So when Viva Connections first came out, the idea was it's a link to my SharePoint site. And they've put this kind of landing page, if you will, with cards and tiles in the middle between that action or between that navigation process. And what I think organizations need to do is to use that to their advantage. So put their popular links there, use adaptive cards to help configure, request process or something of that nature. The other piece is I've seen organizations start to use that page when they're announcing timelines on things, when they're announcing, a system being, updated and needs to be offline for a period of time. So actually utilizing that dashboard as that main area. It might be cross-posted on the SharePoint intranet if somebody goes there, but from there being able to bring that directly to where somebody's working. The other piece to keep in mind, I think, as we think of that employee engagement, a lot, and you mentioned this a little bit about the brand center that's available, but actually, with Copilot specifically, branding is important. And so being able to use your images, being able to have your PowerPoint presentation added there. I've even gone as far as help an organization with custom fonts included there. And for any of you that have worked with SharePoint for a number of years, if somebody came to you and said you needed to modify the master page to use custom fonts, you would have cringed. It was a relatively easy process. So upload the fonts, tag them appropriately, and all was well. But yeah, I think the Viva Connections is really a key piece. But what are some of the pieces that you would add on to that SharePoint home site, right? Is it a workflow, forms? Like what other tools can come in to help with employee communication hubs?
Yeah, there's a variety of different types of web parts that you're able to add to a specific intranet or landing page. Some of the most frequent ones I think that a lot of organizations benefit from are the news and announcements area. That can also be sent via Outlook. So if you do create a news post, you can have that option to send it right via Outlook instead of working in two different platforms and doing that or duplicating efforts. You also have that people web part, kind of creates that real company feel when you see people's profiles, who's involved, who can I contact. Quick links is definitely the biggest one that's utilized. So just having that centralized repository of links that are utilized org-wide. A lot of times we see forms, so it has that direct connection to Microsoft Forms where you're able to just embed that form and be able to actually fill it out right there without clicking into an additional browser. Microsoft Forms also has the ability to connect to Power Automate and create a flow that generates those responses to a SharePoint list. So that's really beneficial from a tracking perspective. And I think, there's a lot of organizations that I see that would like to embed, different images, kind of create that or organizational feel that's digital. Like you said, we're past the time of bulletin boards and, creating images like that. So I think being able to have this almost album of different images from the organization, even also calendars as well. So you have the ability to create different calendars connected to a Microsoft 365 calendar. There's a lot of flexibility there. I see a lot of times embedding YouTube videos as well, or just videos in general, can be very, very helpful for people to see. So there is a lot there. I can go on and on about all the different web parts you can add. But I think one of the other most beneficial ones that I see a lot is actually the PnP Search Center. So there is that, native search center that Microsoft manages and owns built into SharePoint, at that top area of SharePoint that I know a lot of people utilize. But PnP Search Center can be a customizable search center that can be created in addition. So like I said, if there is that space where you have a bunch of departments that have these file repositories, creating that search center is really, really helpful to be able to, filter for specific things that you're looking for, like policies, forms, procedures, and, things where metadata can be attached to specific files there. That gets a little bit more customizable, but I think the beauty of a SharePoint intranet is it could be as simple, bare bones as you want it to be, or it can be a very complex environment for you to work in. So really is up to you in terms of preference there.
And I know that you've done some blog posts about this very topic, so we'll make sure we include that into the description for us. But as we kind of wrap up today, and an organization was brand new, or maybe they had, SharePoint today, what would what are the next steps? How would they start to deploy a communication hub? What would be the steps?
Yeah, I think when I enter those types of conversations, I always ask, what is your wish list of items that you would love displayed? If we were able to create an intranet for you tomorrow, what would you like it to look like? And then we kind of go through what's available, right? Connected to their wish list to what's available. And then I also think from a site branding perspective, making sure you have those, marketing materials or hex codes available for us to be able to kind of recreate in SharePoint. But I think one of the biggest parts is understanding who's going to maintain and own it. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about department champions or those kind of stakeholders involved in the creation and maintenance of that intranet. So establishing those people primarily first, and then kind of getting into these other areas that I'm talking about would be super helpful if you are interested in getting involved in creating that intranet or employee communication hub space.
Yeah, I think those are all good. Coming up with a design in mind, who's going to maintain it going forward. It's pretty safe to say that from a uptime or making sure it's available, with moving to SharePoint Online through Microsoft 365, that's not a requirement anymore. It's people don't go to websites and areas that become stale. And so making sure that they stay up to date with what's happening in the organization, using Copilot now to help draft pages. Maybe that's a topic we can also add on in the future. Pretty fascinating if those of you that haven't seen that already, but making those announcements and other items come clear. Any closing thoughts, Isabella?
I think if you are interested in seeing what's possible, there is something called a SharePoint Lookbook that Microsoft has developed for you to be able to see, different options for what SharePoint can look like, just to kind of get the gears turning. I think that's always helpful to see examples. But I think that was the only thing I wanted to add there. Really appreciate everybody's time today, and looking forward to some more discussions surrounding some of these other topics that we've covered. So maybe you'll see one on Copilot in SharePoint, or maybe one on Viva.
Yep.
But looking forward to chatting next, Pat.
Yeah, I agree. I think as we're unpacking all the different tools in Microsoft 365, it's not just one, it's about the entire story and how they all come together, and how you can make that streamlined. See what I did there?
There we go. There we
All right.
go.
Well, until
All right.
next time, cheers, Isabella.
Cheers.